Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the chair of the Revolution 250 Advisory Committee. Revolution 250 is a consortium of about 60 plus organizations in and around Massachusetts looking to commemorate the events that led to the American Revolution. And I am very pleased today to be joined by Shawn Quiqley, who is a ranger with the National Parks of Boston. Welcome, Shawn.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
It's great to see you. And so you actually wear a number of hats because the National Parks of Boston encompass a number of different historical sites and entities. So can you tell us a bit about your work with the Park Service?
Yeah, sure. So I do wear a bunch of different hats, even though I'm obviously currently not wearing the famed flat hat. But so the National Parks of Boston is made up of 3 national park sites in the downtown area. I think people are often kind of surprised when they hear that there's a national park in the middle of a city. But I think what's important about the Park Service is we're here to preserve, not only natural resources, but also cultural resources. So within the downtown area, you have Boston National Historical Park, which, is really focused on the events leading up to the American Revolution, along the Freedom Trail, giving Freedom Trail tours, visitor center located at Faneuil Hall, as well as up in Charlestown with the Charlestown Navy Yard, Bunker Hill. So, definitely a, pretty
Dorchester Heights.
Yes, and Dorchester Heights, absolutely. So in kind of with that transition with Dorchester Heights, we also do have Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park, which includes, the 30 plus islands in Boston Harbor, which have obviously that natural resource, going out looking at, various plant life, those natural resources out there, as well as the cultural history, including, Fort Warren, native stories. People have obviously been using the islands for as long as they've been there. So it's, a cool collection, definitely worth visiting if you haven't been. And then finally, where I actually have spent most of my time working is Boston African-American National Historic Site, which is on the north slope of Beacon Hill, Boston's free African-American community, from really looking at stories really from the Revolution through the American Civil War.
Great. And it really is a story that ties in with the American Revolution in a lot of ways. We think of William Cooper Nell, who wrote The Colored Patriots of the Revolution, and other stories of the anti-slavery movement, which begins really on Beacon Hill.
Yeah. I think, with that community, it's a very small, tight-knit group of people, right? It's only, looking at the 1860 census, roughly like 2,200 individuals. It's 1.5% of Boston's entire population. But this community is really instrumental in leading a social revolution that is taking hold in the 19th century here in this country. Within the National Parks of Boston, we often like to say, it's kind of a park of revolution. You have that political revolution in the 18th century, that social revolution in the 19th century, and then with the Harbor Islands, it's this environmental revolution, cleaning up of the Boston Harbor. But, I think within the American Revolution, obviously Boston and Bostonians take a lot of pride in this being one of the crucial spaces where the United States started. And I think that that's something that the abolitionists, and, I think a very important one that you just named, William Cooper Nell, that's a part of the fabric of who they are. They see themselves within that anti-slavery community as inheritors of the legacy of the American Revolution. And I think Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, a book written by William Cooper Nell, is a great kind of primary source example of that, because Nell took it upon himself as a historian to go around, collect stories of African Americans who had fought in the American Revolution, and really use those stories, that collection of stories, as an example of not only the sacrifice of African American men in the war for American independence, but also use that as a claim to citizenship. Again, owning the revolution for themselves.
Right, and it is really, in a lot of ways, the Black community in Boston that brings back the memory of the Boston Massacre. And Nell's book begins with the story of Crispus Attucks, and then in the 1850s. Can you talk a little bit about the 1850s and what's happening?
Yeah, so a definitely a tumultuous time in our nation in the 1850s. So I think first, what I want to do is I want to touch upon Attucks and then kind of go back to some of the stuff that's going on in the 1850s, or some of the other things that are going on in the 1850s, I should say. So Crispus Attucks, as I'm sure a lot of, listeners or individuals watching this know, is, African-American man believed to be of African or native descent. There's not a lot that we know about Attucks that we can say for fact, but we do know that he was one of the victims of the Boston Massacre. And I think the memory of him really after the massacre kind of fades a little bit, but then really kind of comes back to the forefront thanks to the efforts of the abolitionists in the 19th century in Boston. Again, looking at this idea of this claim to citizenship, because many people consider him, even though obviously this can be debated, as the first casualty of the revolution, if you will, one of the first to spill blood. And what Nell does is he uses Attucks as a symbol. And this is kind of, I think, quick aside, the Revolutionary Spaces and their new exhibit at the Old State House, Remembering Attucks, does a phenomenal job of looking how Attucks' memory has been used since the massacre up until the present day. They have a bunch of wonderful online resources, definitely worth checking them out. But I think one thing that they talk about and that, is really important is that Attucks as a symbol almost becomes, more important than who he was while he was living. Because abolitionists like Nell use Attucks, elevating him and to an equal playing field with Samuel Adams, John Hancock, these founding fathers that Bostonians idolize. And, this is Nell claiming a part of that stage. And one of the ways that he goes about trying to keep Attucks' memory in the public conscience is through getting a memorial to him, which takes a while, but does eventually happen on the Boston Common, still stands today. But he also brings a celebration known as Attucks Day, which takes place at Faneuil Hall. Which is where Attucks, along with the, I forget exactly how many massacre victims it was. You can correct me on this. I think it might have been 2 or 3 that laid in state at Faneuil Hall.
Close, I think, yeah.
Yeah. So what Nell does is he uses this as, to talk about Attucks, to, again, bring him to that, kind of public forefront, using him as that, one of the martyrs of the revolution. But it's also twofold. It's not only as a way to evoke the memory of Attucks, but it's also a way to combat things that are going on in the country at the time period. A very notable Attucks Day celebration took place in the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision. And the Dred Scott decision was a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1857, where the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott, a man who sued for his freedom because he traveled to a northern state. Basically, he could not sue for his freedom because he was African-American. Therefore, as an African-American, he was not a citizen. He was not equal, so he could not sue in court. It was this idea that, if you were born, even if you were born free as an African-American in the eyes of the United States Supreme Court, you were not an equal citizen. You were not on equal footing to white people in this country. So what Nell does is he uses Crispus Attucks as a direct rebuttal to the Dred Scott decision. He holds this meeting at Faneuil Hall, and throughout the speeches, you can really see the language being used as saying, we have sacrificed for this nation since it was founded, therefore we deserve a claim to this equal citizenship.
Yes, and I should point out that one of the justices, Benjamin Curtis from Massachusetts, dissented from the decision because, in fact, here you have this case in 1770 when Crispus Attucks, a man of color, is shot by British troops who were then put on trial for their lives for having killed a black man. So how can you then say, as the Chief Justice did, that a black man had no rights which a white man is bound to respect? Now, so it's a great reminder of that revolutionary legacy, but I'm wondering if the pro-slavery side also saw antecedents in the revolutionary story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think throughout our history, you can look at the founding of this nation, and I think, left, right, all sides of the political aisle have, found inspiration within, the beginnings of this country and kind of weaponizing history to fight for whatever their common cause is. And I think a good example of this, they take place right here in Boston. You have actually in 1850, a law is passed by the United States government known as the Fugitive Slave Law. And it's built upon an older fugitive slave law from 1793. But basically what this law states is that anybody, federal marshals can go into any northern state or territory and essentially kidnap people, re-enslaving them. There are other stipulations of the law, heavy fines, jail time, people can be deputized on the spot. So it's a pretty big deal that's very divisive within the country. And there is a massive meeting at Faneuil Hall speaking out against this fugitive slave law. Frederick Douglass is there, kind of titans of the abolitionist movement. And, even Douglass himself, he actually evokes the memory of Bunker Hill when he's talking about resistance to the fugitive slave law, saying, that people living in this, in the city who, may be African-American are afraid that hunters of men will appear here in the city under the shadow of Bunker Hill and seize them. So you think about that idea of liberty. But a month after that meeting, you actually have a constitutional, pro-constitution or pro-union meeting. And this is kind of essentially the debate that you see. This, we need to disobey the fugitive slave law in obedience to a higher law, or we need to obey the fugitive slave law because it is, constitutional law. It's been passed by the government and, we do not want to create disunion. And the first speaker at this pro-constitution meeting is John C. Warren, the nephew of Joseph Warren, who, stands up there and basically says, I have this sacred blood running through my veins and we need to preserve the Union and protect the Constitution. The seal of the Confederacy had George Washington on it. So this is something that is being weaponized by both sides.
It really is. It's really such a fascinating period, terrible and fascinating for these reasons. And, and you do see in the 1850s, the founders in a big way being revived as their papers are being published. And Frederick Douglass gives his great speech about the 4th of July, but he also breaks with Garrison over, is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? And he does say that if Jefferson or Madison showed up in Virginia, they would be hanged as traitors. So it's really fascinating to see this really intense debate about what this whole legacy means and whose side is it on. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I think that it is something that really you can look at kind of any point in our history and you can see people evoking the American Revolution. I always think of, I think it was JFK who gave a speech at Faneuil Hall and kind of, and I'm paraphrasing here, talks about how this whole hall reminds us of who we've been, where we've come from, and, kind of where we need to go. It's inspiration in the founding of the country. And I think abolitionists, white and black, really did see the revolution and see kind of this rhetoric of overthrowing tyranny as something that they were doing. They were inheriting that. They were continuing the struggle that began, as they said, in 1776.
So you're fortunate you get to tell these stories quite frequently to visitors and students and all. I'm really wondering how you broach this. You've talked about history being weaponized and it's really not your role. So how do you come down when you're telling these stories that someone might take to have ramifications today?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it's an important one because as a representative of the National Park Service, when I'm presenting these stories, I need to make sure that I am presenting facts, words that were said, and people can draw their own conclusions and their own opinions. But I'm not coming in with a political opinion. As a member of the federal government, that is not my role here. So I think that there are a variety of ways that we can go about doing this. And one of my favorites that we've kind of recently honed in on over the years and have crafted a couple of times is this program that we run actually at Faneuil Hall. And it's a program that explores the arrest and subsequent trial and rendition of Anthony Burns. So Anthony Burns Quiqley is a freedom seeker coming from Virginia, comes to Boston, is arrested under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. He's arrested in May of 1854. There is a mass meeting at Faneuil Hall. Roughly 5,000 people apparently tried to fit inside of it. Yeah, that's a definitely without fire codes then for sure. But then what happens is a smaller group actually attacks the courthouse where Anthony Burns is being held. They try to break him out. They are unsuccessful. A federal marshal is actually killed, named James Batchelder from Charlestown. And then what happens in the aftermath of that is the military is called in, and troops a week later will force, this 20-year-old march him down State Street to board a ship to go back to the institution of slavery. So obviously it's this really powerful, emotional story that is, I would say, definitely not as well known when people first come to Boston. But how we try to go about it is that we do, it's kind of a spin-off of our town meeting program that we've been doing, which really focuses on the American Revolution. We extended that a little bit to look at Anthony Burns. Essentially what we do is we have character cards. We have 2 arguments that people read those character cards off of. There's a higher law, which is, that resisting the Fugitive Slave Law because it is immoral. And then the constitutional law argument, which really looks at, again, obeying this law, even if you don't like it because it, has been passed by Congress. So we use, and those are rooted in primary sources. We may have changed the language just a little bit to kind of adjust it to, 21st century eyes, but making sure that we keep the root of the argument within those cards. But then we take people out and offer, if they're interested in kind of exploring it further, a walking tour. Fittingly, the walking tour portion is called Ghosts of the Revolution. And how we go about doing this to, really, again, this emotionally charged story that people have definitely made connections from the past to the present. So what I like to do is I give people, as we go to each stop, I pass out a series of quotes. And these quotes may be taken from journals. These quotes may be taken from newspapers, but they are direct quotes of people who witnessed Anthony Burns marching down State Street. I ask somebody to read the quote out loud, and then I ask people, what do you think about it? I can facilitate that conversation. People can make those connections, but I'm not making those connections for them. They are coming to their own conclusions. And I think that, it's a really valuable way to go about doing this because it's not just that sage on the stage, me just talking at people for, 45 minutes or an hour. It's letting people kind of come in, read these quotes, these words in the spaces where they happened, and, arrive at, maybe some conclusions that they connect to something that they experienced in their life.
Well, let me ask, once the pandemic is over, how would someone arrange to have one of your tours, either of the Freedom Trail as we know it, or of the Ghosts of the Revolution, or how would we go about connecting with you or others from the national park?
So I see that our website has been dropped in. That's great. We do offer when kind of, again, I think the website's the best way to kind of check, especially with the pandemic as it is, going and trying to figure out exactly how we're going to go about doing these things. But normally what we do is we offer walking tours, Black Heritage Trail, which goes into the North Slope of Beacon Hill 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. And then the Freedom Trail we offer 7 days a week. And then the Ghosts of the Revolution and the town meeting programs we do in the weekends. So those will be Saturday and Sunday. And the times are kind of, they're in flux right now, but again, I would definitely recommend our website is the best place to kind of keep up to date with this stuff. And we do have our contact information there, so you can reach out, and we're here to answer any of your questions.
Great. Another character I found really interesting is George Middleton, who lived in the oldest house on Beacon Hill, and there's some mystery about, did he serve in the Revolution or afterward? Can you tell us a little bit more about George Middleton?
Yeah, so I think that you're saying the mystery part of it definitely is, a huge part of his story. Because like with a lot of these things, there isn't a lot of primary sources that we can look to. However, regarding Middleton, probably the best information that we have about him comes from The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, William Cooper Nell's book. It is believed that he was in a militia group called the Bucks of America. It was a black militia group here in Boston. Now, we're not exactly sure what that militia group would have done. We believe that they probably or likely would have been in Boston kind of protecting the town. What we do know about them, we do have two artifacts directly related to the Bucks of America. One is a small medallion, and the other is actually their flag, which was presented to them by Governor John Hancock. And I believe that both of those things are owned by Mass Historic, but are currently on loan to the African-American Smithsonian. I've seen them there. It was really interesting when I turned the corner and saw that and was like, oh, there's the flag. So yeah, so we know that he was, in the Revolution, but then he kind of is a good example of representing that transition to the North Slope community. Because as you said, he does live in a duplex home that is believed to be the oldest home on Beacon Hill. And he becomes a leader in the free black community later in his life. He is a member of what is known as the African Society, which is like a self-help group, kind of providing people with clothing, food, various sorts of things. And he was also a Grand Master of the Prince Hall Masons, which were an African-American Masonic lodge, still exists today, and was founded by Prince Hall, who was, here in Boston. So he's definitely a important kind of leader in the early free black community.
That's interesting. Can you tell us what's been the most interesting question you've gotten from a visitor about any of the stories you've told along the trails?
And
if it's one you can't repeat, then tell us the second most interesting.
I think I often get, I think people are, when they come on the trail, I think often, kind of the questions that I enjoy getting are when people are really interested in kind of learning about, say, like the Underground Railroad and kind of having this idea of the Underground Railroad, and then being able to take them to a place like the Lewis Hayden home and say, there was actually a tunnel in here. I've seen it. We have primary source evidence that says he kept kegs of gunpowder by his front steps. And kind of, getting that type of question of like, oh, the Underground Railroad, and then being able to actually bring somebody to that space and say, maybe the kind of mythology of the Underground Railroad we have, skewers a little bit of what the reality of it was. But we go to places like this, and it's, that a kind of old adage of sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And it's like you get to be at these spaces and, that place-based experience, it's very powerful.
Really is true. I mean, we do have these sites here, and we do have, I've been told that we have more Underground Railroad sites on the North Slope of Beacon Hill than in any other similarly sized space in the country. It may, that you'll know if that is true or not, but it's certainly part of the fabric of that area, that community.
Yeah, no, for sure. I can't, and I think, again, speaking to like the lack of primary sources, I think it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly like, how many Underground Railroad safe houses in certain different areas and pockets of the country. But Beacon Hill is definitely right up there. And one of the things that we've been doing during the pandemic is actually we created a hub on our website called Boston, an Underground Railroad hub. And it really dives into a lot of these stories. And what we did actually create is a map of documented sites in Boston related to the Underground Railroad. And if you're looking for a visual of what you were just saying, Bob, it's it really speaks to how many there were concentrated on that North Slope. And all of that research is very much, obviously rooted in primary source documents, being able to identify these spaces. But looking at that map, you do really you get it. It's really impressive because, I mean,
It is.
it's an illegal act. You go to jail, it's.
Yeah. And we know that Harriet Beecher Stowe went to Lewis Hayden's house when she was researching Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that Governor Andrew had Thanksgiving dinner with Lewis Hayden just before the Emancipation Proclamation to plan for recruiting the Mass 54th, who's memorialized at the Robert Gould Shaw Mass 54th Memorial. So it is such a visual thing. Now, you do both, you do the Freedom Trail. I'm not quite sure if the Park Service calls it the Freedom Trail, the tour you do of revolutionary Boston, as well as the African-American site. And what are people looking for when they come to Boston to take these historical tours?
So I think what people are looking for is, people are really interested in a lot of these sites. And I think, the motivations can vary depending upon which tour you're interested. But I think the fundamental, root of kind of what people are seeking is being able to learn something new, experience the history, deep history in a space, obviously like Boston, but be able to get it in a way that is informative, but also not boring. And I think, what the Park Service really tries to do is to make sure that we can do both of those things. Provide an experience that is very much rooted in fact, creates a narrative, but also leaves people with more questions than they came in. And it's really cool to be able to work at a space like Faneuil Hall, North Slope of Beacon Hill, and be able to touch upon all these different stories and try to connect them for people.
And what got you, Shawn, interested in history?
Well, I remember coming on the Freedom Trail when I was like 9 years old. My dad really was interested in history, and I always kind of was fascinated with the Revolution growing up specifically. And then, obviously came to Suffolk. You were one of my teachers, which also helped. And then once I was going to Suffolk, I really kind of learned more about the North Slope community when I got the job with the Park Service. And, I am equally as fascinated by the anti-slavery movement and the abolitionists and kind of that, again, the revolution that's rooted here in Boston, political and social.
So you've been able so far to make your career with the Park Service telling these stories, which is a great thing to be able to share. And I should have mentioned that you were one of my best students. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, you were a great teacher. Thank you.
Well, thanks. So, yeah. So
you are a great teacher. I'm just not taking any classes with you.
Well, thanks. Well, when you were talking about being a sage on a stage, talking for 50 minutes, I thought we're cutting a little close to the bone. So what's been for you the most surprising thing you found in the years now, a few years you've been able really to dig into these different stories and not just, as you said, give the general overview, but really dig in? What has really surprised you the most?
I mean, I think I've done a lot of research specifically just around the Fugitive Slave Law and the reactions here in Boston. And I think that the kind of when you read things and really get into reading letters and hearing different arguments in the minds of people, I think that that has been one of the most fascinating things, because it's whenever I read, these firsthand accounts and narratives, I always try to kind of put myself in these spaces during this time period and understand, try as best I can to understand what might have been going through these people's minds and how I might have reacted in a similar situation. And, I think it's just the bravery of people, but also, going back and forth and trying to decide what is right and making a difficult decision on something that maybe is not really at the forefront of what you're thinking. Because I think, when we go back and we think about like the 19th century, right? It's like, Underground Railroad. It's like you want to talk about Frederick Douglass, you want to talk about Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln, these people that we've really elevated, and, rightfully so for the work that they did. But I think it's, it's equally as fascinating as trying to, understand how somebody who's, trying to put food on the table, work, take care of their family, is also understanding, how this political storm is swirling and where they find themselves, kind of landing on this, and whether that person is then going to write a letter, donate money, or literally take action. And a lot of people did, take to the streets and take action. And it's, it is really interesting to see how people change kind of as, events are unfolding, and we have the hindsight of looking back and tracing that rather than in a lived lifetime in, a couple hours of reading.
Great, thank you. I know there's a lot more we could talk about, Shawn, but our time right now is up. So thank you so much for coming and sharing what happens with the National Parks of Boston, and thank you for the good work you do there in telling these stories and finding new stories to tell. It's been really great talking to you. And
thank you very much for having me. I appreciate being on.
Great, thanks. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and our musicians, Doug Quigley, no relation to Shawn Quiqley, who plays the fife, Peter Emmerich, also on the fife, and Dave Emmerich, who play our theme song, The Road to Boston. So thank you, Shawn, and I'll see you out on the streets.
Indeed.